Hello, and welcome to International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Denis Danicic. And full disclosure, I'm a little sick today, so I'm going to be sniffling, sneezing, and coughing throughout this entire report. Usually, we report on some kind of current or global affair that's going on. However, today, August 19th, 2021, marks a very special anniversary. That is August 19th of 1991. Specifically the beginning of the August Coup in the former USSR. This event is extremely important for modern day politics and history in general. It shows a moment where people, not a military force, not a government force, but people were able through their sheer will, their organization, and through clear protests, prevent the institution and continuation of an oppressive regime. It's a tragedy that this event is not taught in schools all over the world. Most people don't even know about this event. In fact, it's what precipitated the dissolution of the USSR. We're going to go into the background of what led into this, the results of what happened, and the events of how the exact events transpired. So let's start. In late 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev is the president and general secretary of the Communist Party in the USSR. Gorbachev wanted to institute more liberal policies to liberalize, modernize, and make the USSR more progressive. At the same time, through his laws of perestroika and glasnost, it would lead to republics having more autonomy and more sovereignty, leaving less power in the USSR's hands. Over time, economic problems would begin to happen. 50% of stores did not have enough stocks for the winter. Inflation was at a 300% level. People were upset. In addition to this, Gorbachev's ministers, military leaders, specifically Dmitry Yarov and other actors, were beginning to feel upset and nervous and beginning to realize that they would lose control over Eastern European countries and the 15 Soviet republics. They believed that it was time to institute a coup d'etat on Gorbachev. Gorbachev was warned about this. He knew that this would happen and he was aware. However, he did not know where it would come from. In fact, the US ambassador at the time to the USSR was informed of the potential coup and the fact that this was being planned against Gorbachev in early 1991. In around June, he informed Mikhail Gorbachev, listen man, your ministers, your generals, your higher-ups are planning to overthrow you in a coup d'etat. Gorbachev said, I'm aware of this. I know that someone is planning to attempt to overthrow me, but we have nothing to worry about. It'll be fine. And he believed that his ministers, that his top advisors would not actually work against him. And this was shown in a bug that was placed during a meeting by his bodyguard, who would later become president of Russia, Vladimir Medvedev. Following this, Gorbachev would go on vacation in his dacha at the Black Sea in Crimea. While he was on vacation, the Gang of Eight, the 8 ministers and generals who were in high positions of power that planned to overthrow Gorbachev, would take their plans into action, declaring a state of emergency and declaring themselves the Council of Civil Protection and State Emergency. This would later on become to be known as the Gang of Eight. While Gorbachev was in his dacha, his vacation home, his telephone lines were cut off, his communications were cut off, and KGB agents were placed in front of his vacation home to ensure that he could not come back to Moscow. On August 19th, early in the morning, Muscovites woke up to the sounds of rolling tanks, hundreds of tanks, and hundreds of soldiers marching upon Moscow to overtake power from Gorbachev and institute more oppressive, more totalitarian, and more historically Soviet regime. At that time, Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of the Russian Republic and occasional critic, though occasional ally of Mikhail Gorbachev, and it should be mentioned, one of the people that told Gorbachev, listen, They're going to try and overthrow you. We need to replace these people. We need to remove them from positions of power. The Gorbachev did not listen. Boris Yeltsin realized exactly what was happening. He would leave his Russian presidential palace, which at the time was known as the Russian White House. And Boris Yeltsin famously led protesters in a civic disobedience protest. There was no violence, there were no rocks being thrown, there was no aggression, to show that they were not in support of this kind of totalitarian government. Yeltsin famously stood in front of tanks that were marching upon Moscow and told the soldiers in there, "Will you shoot upon your own people? Will you run over your own people?" And many tank units came out and said that they would support the people and not support the military or the Gang of Eight. This moment was viewed as a gigantic and historic moment of the Russian people's resistance, of their ability to want democracy, to want freedom, to want the ability to choose for themselves, to want a different kind of future that was not the old Soviet-style communist heavy regime. Boris Yeltsin would continue in these protests. Unfortunately, some things did happen during these protests, which some situations escalated and 3 people did die. Specifically, while tanks were heading towards the center of Moscow, 3 people were ran over. And those were the only instances of violence. No shots were fired, no kind of conflict occurred or combat occurred. It was more or less a peaceful protest, and the only form of violence that occurred was accidental violence on the end of the military forces directed by the Gang of Eight. Following these events, Gorbachev, who was visited by some of the members of the Gang of Eight, some of his ministers, in his dacha, his vacation home, and was told, "You have to resign." He said no. He entered a fit of rage, a fit of anger, yelling at them, calling them bastards, calling them pussies, calling them cowards and traitors. Though Gorbachev was not able to leave his vacation home at the time, it would take Boris Yeltsin's civil resistance in Moscow to eventually convince the KGB to allow Boris Yeltsin to be able to leave his vacation home and return to Moscow. In the meantime, in front of the KGB building, the very famous and controversial statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the founder of the Soviet secret police and was a symbol of Soviet oppression, of secret police disappearances, arrests, and quite simply a totalitarian regime. His statue was toppled by the people, not by a government force, not by decree, but simply by the protesters and the people that stated that they wanted a brighter and better and more free future. Mikhail Gorbachev came back to Russia, came back to Moscow. The coup did not succeed. It failed. That being said, Gorbachev lost a major amount of respect. Gorbachev lost a view of power in the eyes of his people. Gorbachev was viewed as weak, ineffective, and clumsy. As a matter of fact, when he was coming back to Moscow, he was filmed leaving his private plane wearing a knitted sweater like an old Russian man on vacation. It was absurd. It was completely absurd. Boris Yeltsin would, following this, become the main power figure in the USSR. 4 months later, the USSR would collapse, leading to massive historical events, which some people called the end of history. Yeltsin would go on to become the first president of the new Russian Federation. And I mentioned that it's unfortunate that this historical event is not so well known. In my opinion, it's one of my favorite historical events, and I think that every child in the world should learn about it. It shows that civic disobedience, that a population, that people alone, without a military force, without government backing, without major funding, can determine the destiny of their nation. Now, does this story have a happy ending? That is debatable. Yeltsin would go on to become the president of Russia. Yeltsin is not remembered for his actions during the August Coup in 1991. Yeltsin is universally and internationally remembered for being, there's really no nice way of putting this, a drunkard, an alcoholic. Yeltsin would famously go on to be drunk, extremely inebriated during many diplomatic events, famously leaving the White House guest house and walking around the streets of DC in his underwear while extremely intoxicated. He would come to diplomatic summits and be so drunk that he was unable to leave his plane. Boris Yeltsin, because of this state, would lose control of the Russian Federation. It's said that 50 to 60% of the GDP of Russia was actually being produced or in control by organized crime. Russia was a madhouse. It was completely disorganized. The economy was not doing well. The people did have democratic freedoms to an extent, but it was disorganized, ineffective, crime was rampant, corruption was out of the roof, and the Russian people saw their country heading in a very bad direction. This would lead to Vladimir Putin being able to take control of Russia in the 2000s. Vladimir Putin still famously leads Russia today, and by many people is considered to be a dictator, or at the very least, a strongman. Do the Russian people have freedom? That is debatable. It really is a matter of debate. Some people feel that they do. Others people feel that Vladimir Putin is just as oppressive as any other dictator. Nonetheless, there is more control, more stability, more opportunity in the Russian economy. How will things move forward in Russia? We can't say, but we will see. Russia is one of the world's most important countries. It's one of the major superpowers. It's a military power. It's extremely active on the world stage, and it's important to understand the history of Russia. Usually, we report on the news, though sometimes we like to talk about major historical events. History helps us understand the present and make projections for the future. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. We want to build a community of independent journalism and reporting here. Subscribe to my channel, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the International News Daily Podcast.